My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Jefferson in Paris, which depicts the escapades of our third president while he was serving as the American ambassador to France.
Are all men created equal, Mr. Jefferson? Or should this read all white men are created equal?
We are responsible for these people as members of our most intimate family.
He's the best master in all of Virginia, but he is the master, and they're the slaves.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who pays all his servants 24 francs a month, regardless of race or gender.
Well, that used to be true, Gary, but now they're demanding their pay in Chinese yuan, which of course is the new emerging global currency. Listeners, Gary's reference is due to the fact that Jefferson paid a couple of his slaves that he brought over to Paris with him some wages, which of course that he didn't pay them back in Virginia.
Paid his mistress 24 francs, just the same as he paid her brother 24 francs. So yeah.
But made it very clear that once they returned to Monticello, the pay would stop.
All right. Well, this is one of the reasons we're going to have to tiptoe through our discussion today, because the movie raises all kinds of issues on race and gender, and some of which are the most contentious in contemporary politics. And you have to be very careful, Jim, because one step could get us canceled.
I'm always careful.
Yeah, but before we get to that, I just want to spend 2 minutes talking about the most prominent president who was on screen this summer. And Jim, I'm assuming you did not see Oppenheimer. Is that correct?
No, I'm looking forward to seeing the movie when it's released in home video. I'm just so scared of COVID that I won't go to theaters. Just joking.
You can wear the mask. I mean, you know.
Oh, well, that will do it.
All right. Well, everyone who hasn't seen it should definitely do so, especially in IMAX if they get a chance. So I assume you know all this, but Gary Oldman plays Harry Truman. Of course, Gary Oldman played Churchill in our most recent podcast. It's a 5-minute scene where Oppenheimer goes in to advocate the U.S. stop the development of the hydrogen bomb. And I think the movie's characterization of Truman is, really believable. He's a genial guy until Oppenheimer talks about how guilty he feels about inventing the bomb. And then he tells Truman that he feels like he has blood on his hands, at which point Truman's eyes narrow and he says, no one will remember who invented the bomb. They'll remember who actually dropped it. So he's taking offense at Oppenheimer for suggesting that it's Truman that has the blood on his hands, I think. So, and then of course, as Oppenheimer is ushered out of the Oval Office, you hear Truman tell his staff not to let that crybaby near him anymore. So
that sounds true to life.
Yeah, it's funny. I've just been listening to another podcast about Truman, and he has a very flat affect in his, very, very not really accented at all. You can't really do you can't do a very good impersonation. So, but I thought it was interesting that we had a president on film this summer, but we won't do that for this. Be a very short discussion, I think.
Well, I can't wait to see it. I'm really looking forward to it.
And I also want to mention, of course, that Barbie has a president in it too. The president of Barbie Land, played by Issa Rae. She doesn't have as much responsibility as Harry Truman did, though. Well,
I'm looking forward to seeing that too. You're way ahead of me, Gary.
I am way ahead of you. I'm right on the cusp of everything that's going on. It's unfortunate there aren't any Truman movies, because he really is a very consequential president, and I like to see what people have to say about him. All right. Well, anyway, enough about Truman. Back to Jefferson. So I'm interested, Jim, to know how emotionally invested in the political fights of the past do you get? Like for me, I'm really partisan when it comes to historical figures such as Richard III, Elizabeth I, Charles II, never mind American political figures. And I'm affronted when my favorite characters from the past are dissed. Do you feel that way? I mean, are you involved do you feel like passionate about the historical figures? And if so, or even if not so, what are your thoughts on Jefferson as a founding father and president coming into this movie?
Well, my first thought is this is going to be a challenge for me because in previous podcasts, I love to regale the audiences by recounting my various personal meetings with this or that president. But I guess I can't do that, can I, with Thomas Jefferson? I can't recall any personal meetings I had with him. Maybe our current president could conjure up some of the meetings he had with Thomas Jefferson, but I can't. So it's going to be a challenge. But seriously, I'm not going to tiptoe around the fact that I believe that Thomas Jefferson was a remarkable and seminal and overwhelmingly positive figure in American history. His participation in the evil institution of slavery and his pretty firmly established sexual relations with slave Sally Hemings was an abomination, of course, and these flaws must always be noted and never airbrushed out of any teachings about Jefferson, but especially with his authorship of the Declaration of Independence and to a lesser extent during his presidency, I think Jefferson gave life, words, and meaning to the founding principles of our country. All the things we cherish or say we cherish today, individual rights, religious freedom, the limits on federal power, the Bill of Rights, which he pushed to be added to the new Constitution. Um, so much positive that he contributed. And these efforts that we hear today to sort of cancel him out and remove statues and all that, I think are just ridiculous. Again, I think we can hold, as you've said in the past, two ideas in our head at the same time. And the two ideas about Thomas Jefferson was that he was a great figure in American history, a positive figure, but that he did participate in these institutions that we rightly consider abominations.
Well, very interesting. It's funny, we've never had a conversation about Jefferson. I personally can't stand the guy. I think he's my least favorite founding father. I think he's the original limousine liberal. He didn't do anything to earn his wealth, spent his whole career pretending to speak for the common man while drinking imported French wine in a mansion that the slaves had built. He's also the founder of the Democratic Party, and as a consequence, has a lot to answer for there. Hired dirty tricksters to slime the Federalists. The one good thing he did do was not reject the Louisiana Purchase, which was negotiated by James Monroe. And I think he actually gets probably more credit for the Declaration of Independence than he deserves. He was more of a consolidator of thoughts and they were floating around, and he just sort of pulled them all together. It's true, but then the Declaration was
watered down.
Well, watered down, yeah, and also revised a lot by the Congress. So
Yeah,
I
but
don't know.
revised how, Gary? By taking out language that he wanted to have in there, criticizing slavery. I know you're a big Federalist and you love you wish we could have, under John Adams, proceeded along his path of having sort of a makeshift monarchy in the United States. And I know you're a New Englander, but I think you're being a little too harsh. Besides, Jefferson was a redhead like me, so I've got to like him.
He's on Mount Rushmore, but his star has really fallen in recent years. I know you probably haven't seen this either, but he's one of the villains of the musical Hamilton, which, for those under a rock, depicts the life of Alexander Hamilton. The second act of the musical starts where this movie ends, with Thomas Jefferson returning from Paris to be Secretary of State. And it's weird. It's very unusual to have someone like Alexander Hamilton be the hero of a rap musical. But so Jefferson arrives. He's a very supercilious figure. It's contrasting with Hamilton, who rose up from nothing and put his life on the line in the Revolutionary War and helped write the Constitution. And then he did more than anyone to get it ratified. But here's the lyrics to the song that Jefferson sings as he gets off the boat from France. And the key phrase is like, "So what did I miss? What did I miss? Virginia, my home sweet home. I want to give you a kiss. I've been in Paris meeting lots of different ladies. I basically missed the late 80s. I traveled the wide, wide world to come back to this. So, it's like he was out of the country when a lot of these most important, when the Constitution was written, he didn't really have anything to do with the Constitution. And um, so anyway, and
Well, I think you're obviously right about the contradictions and the living in the living the high life while uh, pretending or trying to speak up for the average citizen. But that's not unusual in our politics.
no,
And
everyone's a
as
hypocrite.
Yeah, and well, it's not even hypocrisy. It's again, it's your two ideas and at the same time. Was he because he was trying to stand up for average people because as a lawyer he defended numerous slaves' attempt to secure their freedom, things like that. Um, because so he was supposed to deliberately impoverish himself. By the way, he did impoverish himself
He did
by the
impoverish
end of
himself
his life.
by spending a lot of money on himself.
But he also established the University of Virginia. He just did many things. He was a Renaissance man, and Renaissance men were not known to living like the rabble that they purported to represent. So I think what you're doing is some of the problem we have today, where we take today's measuring sticks and today's standards and apply them to the past. And if you want to support the president, John Adams, who enacted the sedition law, which actually jailed people for criticizing the government, if that's what you want to defend, and criticize Jefferson for forming an alternate party in order to oppose that and get rid of the Sedition Act as soon as he became president, have at it. But count me out.
Okay. I will also say the thing that this movie does do a good job of depicting is soft-brained thinking about political theory. At one point, he says, there's nothing to be feared in the triumph of the people. They've been warped by generations of tyranny, but they're naturally good. I mean, this is a dumbed down version of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we studied together in political science in college. He also believed in the goodness of natural man. And I, I think conservatives have a more tragic view of human nature and believe you need to create institutions like the family, the church, fraternal organizations to channel these individual passions for the sake of the good. And this whole idea that Jefferson's standing up for the common man, I'm not sure is exactly true, because he was really standing up, I think, for Virginia, which was based on farming and he was against all kinds of industrialization and finance and all the things that really eventually ended up making America great.
Well, yeah, that was the vision. I think to understand how people like Jefferson wove things together, he had to be for the idea that the common man was inherently good, because that was his justification, if you will, for saying that the common man had inalienable rights. If common men did not have innate goodness, then how could we support that they should all have equal political rights as opposed to having a noblesse oblige? So it does knit together in a coherent way. I actually think I know he's claimed by the Democrats more, or he was, but I actually think he was more Republican. And in fact, in his inaugural address, when he won the very contentious election of 1800, he tried to bond with his rival, the Federalists, and said, "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans." So I hear you, and I know where it's coming from too, because I know you, Gary. But and I'm not arguing that there weren't huge contradictions, many of which are brought out in this movie, and not just about slavery, but about living the high life in France while being sort of an armchair supporter of the French Revolution.
All right. Well, maybe we should get on to the movie, and we can discuss, have this discussion further. It's interesting. One good thing about this project is you and I get to talk about presidents that we've never once ever mentioned to
Yeah, I
each other.
can't remember in 50 years ever finding
Talking
out
about
that you
Jefferson.
love John Adams and hate Thomas Jefferson.
Well, I don't love John Adams, but I do love Alexander Hamilton. So,
Yeah,
um, although I
central
have a lot,
banks
of
and
course, I have an affinity for uh, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Maybe we'll get to him eventually. Well, we should talk about the movie because this is what this podcast is about. I'm going to do a summary. You ready for the
sure.
summary? Okay. So, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, which I assume is practically everyone because it was a bomb, um, Jefferson in Paris is a 1995 movie about the 4 years that Jefferson spent as ambassador to France. It's brought to us by the Merchant and Ivory team that had produced glossy literary hits like A Room with a View, Howard's End, The Remains of the Day. Unlike those movies, which are dramatizations of high end literary novels, this is an original story based loosely on a biography by Fawn Brodie, who was one of the first serious historians to argue that Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' children. So this is really two movies. The first half begins with Jefferson, played by Nick Nolte, arriving in Paris with his daughter Patsy, who's portrayed by Gwyneth Paltrow, and she's conveniently shipped off to a convent school. Jefferson becomes a prominent figure in French society and almost immediately falls into a passionate relationship with Maria Cosley, the wife of a gay British artist and a painter herself. Eventually, they embrace and share a big lip lock, after which Jefferson literally falls head over heels, breaks his wrist, and gets depressed. The second half of the movie begins with the arrival of Jefferson's other daughter, Polly, and her slave companion, Sally Hemings. Sally cheers Jefferson up a lot, maybe too much. Meanwhile, Patsy, who's initially jealous of Maria, now becomes really jealous of Sally. And as for Maria, she's grossed out that Jefferson is sleeping with a slave and breaks up with him. Eventually, it transpires that Sally is pregnant. Sally and her brother initially threaten to stay behind in Paris when Jefferson returns to America, but they cut a deal under which Sally, her children, and her brother will eventually be free if they return with him to Monticello. And finally, as a backdrop to all of this, the French are getting ready to have their revolution. And we get a lot of commentary by Jefferson about Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the French aristocracy. Okay, got anything to add there?
No, no,
There's a lot
I
going
didn't
on in this
know.
movie.
Yeah, that's one of my comments. Is like in the first 15 minutes they introduce like 6, 7 different plots,
Yeah,
and then the subsequent scenes reflect that, and bouncing from one plot line to another.
yeah.
What do you know about Merchant and Ivory? I didn't even know about them. Their team. They were a professional team, and then they were a domestic partnership team as well.
Yeah, I know a little bit. I've watched quite a few of their movies. They were before Miramax came around along. They were kind of a, a smaller version of what Miramax eventually became. They produced these really artsy fartsy movies and very literary. A lot of them based on classic novels. So I like them. I think they're a good team, but I think they kind of got out of their lane with this particular movie.
Mm. Mm. How did you said it was a flop? Did we really pick another flop?
Can you believe it? Well, I think this is actually the flop of all flops. The domestic box office was 2.5 million, and it generated 3.4 million international for a total of 5.9. That was off a budget of 14 million, so it lost a lot of money. It ranked 196th, which is the lowest yet among all the movies in 1995.
Well,
It's
what's
really
our
good.
highest? 150.
Well, actually, the Remains of the Day, they got $64 million. So that they had quite a few hits. So
Yeah.
they had a good track record, and all of a sudden they did this. Back in 1995, the number one hit was Batman Forever, and other movies that year. Top movies that year were Apollo 13, Toy Story, Pocahontas, and Ace Ventura. So who would you, Jim? we haven't you haven't told me yet whether you like the movie or not, but who would you recommend it to?
Um, I think those who like historical costume dramas, those interested in Jefferson and the early days of the US, those interested in seeing a warts and all take on Thomas Jefferson, the moral issues surrounding slavery, those who are interested in France because it's set in France, filmed there, which part of the things that I did like about the movie, there are things I didn't like, was that it was actually wasn't on a Hollywood soundstage. It was set in France, and it was really fascinating to see all those stinking of the ages real life sets, and then all the costumes and such. So that's who I'd recommend it to, basically.
Yeah, I actually think more or less the same thing. We don't really learn a lot about U.S. history in here. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is not corresponding with James Madison about the Constitution or anything like that. But I did actually learn. It's not that I learned a lot about the French Revolution, but I, saw it more in perspective and saw it dramatized in a way that, I haven't seen in a lot of other movies. I would recommend it to people who are mildly interested in the French Revolution.
The other thing is, I guess it's worth pointing out that this is apparently the first filmic portrayal of Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings.
Right.
And so that's important as a historical artifact, if you
Yeah.
will,
Yeah.
in that sense. I like the music in the film too. I'm not crazy about harpsichords,
Yeah.
but I did like both the actual musical performances and the background music during some of the scenes. I thought was used to good effect to portray the drama of what was going on. And I'll say one other thing about, the sort of the costume drama and depiction of the French aristocracy. Based on this movie, anyway, never has a group needed overthrowing more than this group. Never has a revolution seemed more justified. Now, we
Right.
all know that the revolution turned pretty bad itself, the reign of terror and all
Right.
that,
Right.
the beheadings. But this was a decadent, extravagant, frivolous group that you just wanted to say, give me my musket. I want to participate in this revolution.
I
So I
know.
thought it was effective in that way.
Yeah. 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 Um, if I don't know if we've sort of merged into the what we liked part yet, but one thing I thought was very good was the richness of the camera work. James Ivory,
Yes.
who's the director, has a way of making a low budget movie look like it has a big budget. You really did feel like you were looking at France in that period of time. The costumes, the makeup. I mean, it's hard to know what it really looked like, but this really did seem like it was there. And you're right, it was appalling the way those people carried on.
On the other hand, because, as we mentioned, there were so many plot lines, the French Revolution, the aristocracy, uh, Jefferson mourning his late wife, um, the Sally Hemings plot line, the love affair with Maria plot line, all of that. Um, it was very herky jerky directing. And I guess what I would say about that, it kept me from getting bored. It was a long movie. It was 2 hours and 20 minutes. It kept me from getting bored. And you were always wondering what, in a flash of a second, was going to come next. It was kind of like watching a car wreck
Yeah,
where you're not supposed to slow down and look, but you have to look because
yeah.
you want to see various details. So I don't know exactly what I think of the directing and that you kind of praised because it was so herky jerky.
The directing that I praised was the way they were able to squeeze out such a big picture, full view of the French society in the 1780s on such a small budget. That's really what
Yeah, that's
I mean.
true. 14 million bucks.
Yeah, it's a lot. I'll tell you one other thing I liked about the movie, which is something we'll probably talk about later. It actually, I've always known that slavery was terrible, of course. Grew up in New England where we all, look down on the South and all that. But mostly I've considered it through the impact on the field hands who were brutalized and the families that were broken up in slave auctions and the really, the terrible conditions they were under. But this is the first time I really thought deeply about the nuances of slavery, so like especially when you consider the relationship between the children of fathers who have different mothers. When Patsy slaps Sally, she's slapping her aunt, you know, and
Right.
you don't really understand. I don't understand how a man could have a child with a slave and then treat that child as a slave to be sold away um, to someone else. And also because Sally is the daughter of and granddaughter of a white man, she's really only one-fourth black. And her son, James Earl Jones, who plays her son, older son, he's one-eighth black. And you know, like, how white do you have to be to be considered white? I mean, this
To be
whole
treated decently.
yeah, to be treated decently. I mean, it's weird. I mean, that whole it's hard to envision what these people, these men especially, were thinking back then when they had these children and didn't treat them like their children.
Yeah, it got into some of the really awkward and tawdry practicalities of slavery. We talked about the idea of you get wages when you're with me in France, but back at
Right,
Virginia, you don't get paid anymore. I
right.
mean, those kind of dehumanizing practicalities behind slavery. And you're right, all of the what ended up being in inbreeding and incestuous kinds of relations to the point where Sally, Jefferson's lover, was a half sister of his own late wife.
Right. So he's sleeping with his
Yeah,
sister-in-law.
right. And it's really tawdry. And I think the movie did portray a lot of that. I have some problems with the execution of that portrayal, particularly with the James Hemming character, played by Seth Gillen,
Yeah.
because he he was far more articulate than probably someone of his station should be, and more verbosely and sophisticatingly articulate. And yet, just to make sure we knew that he was still basically an uneducated slave, he would throw in very awkwardly, I needs to go there,
Yeah.
kinds
Right.
of
Right.
grammatical
Right.
quirks, just to sort of say, hey, I really am a slave, but beyond that, I'm going to talk in very modern terms about
Right.
my rights and the principles and all that. So I
Right.
thought some of the execution, the ideas were good in terms of portraying the sadness behind it all, but some of the execution I thought was pretty bad
Yeah. It was.
or ham-handed.
Anytime
Let me put it that way.
anytime you're dealing with dialect, you're really stepping on dangerous ground. I did think that Sally Hemings talked a little bit like, she was out of Gone with the Wind, and
Right,
the slaves back then, and Butterfly McQueen.
right.
She talked a little bit like her. So anyway, I would say another. I guess we're switching over to what we didn't like. My biggest objection was they didn't translate the French dialogue. I couldn't understand the
Oh,
give
I
and take.
know. Yeah,
What was going
yeah.
on? I mean, a lot of what it was important and interesting about this movie is what's going on with the French Revolution. And one point, someone comes to the king with a
A
piece of
message.
paper,
Yeah.
and he's crying, and they're like, what's he crying about? I mean, there's a lot, he has a lot to cry about, but like, what did he read in that piece of paper? That was a
Well, I
lot of.
took French in high school, but even I could only conjure up a few words. But yeah, that was really weird. That was a strange thing. I
And
just
everyone,
didn't like, yeah,
go ahead.
I think ultimately, when some of the not likes will come in when we talk about the actors,
Yeah,
but I think the I think it tried to do too much
yeah,
without getting deep enough into any of the plot lines.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so that was my biggest problem
Well,
beyond what I'll say about some of the acting.
yeah, yeah. My friend Phil Tascio and I used to joke that when a costume drama is a little slow, you don't say it's boring, you say that it's stately. Um, and I wasn't exactly bored with the movie. I like you, I was interested, but I did feel like this could have been a little shorter. Um, this whole Catholic school thing. Patsy's away at Catholic school, and she decides to become a Catholic to Jefferson's horror because he can't stand the Catholics. I mean, that's a whole plot line that you could have skipped.
Right, although that was one of my favorite scenes.
Okay,
But
all
we'll
right.
get to that. But I think you're right. I think there could have been a little less scenes of the decadence of the aristocracy. They did that a lot.
Yeah, there
There
was
was a
yeah,
picnic, there was an opera house thing, there was a party, and it just sort of, okay, we get the point.
right,
How
right. The
about how
movie is
decadent.
right, right, right. So what do you think the movie? We know what we think they actually did accomplish, but what do you think they were trying to accomplish?
I think they were trying to show a different side of Jefferson. As we pointed out, this was the first time the relationship with Sally Heming was portrayed on film. And, when you have a president, a historical figure that a lot of historians have delved into, that is figures large in the popular culture, whenever you can find a new angle, filmmakers think that's might be a good subject for a film. So I think that was part of it, much like, uh, you know, the FDR film, Hyde Park on Hudson, tried to show a different side of FDR. Um, and I think that they were trying to show that the relationship between Sally and Jefferson. But what was so interesting to me, and what I really think was the most politically incorrect thing about the film, was that she was portrayed as the pursuer,
Right.
and he was portrayed as the sort of reticent. And I think that the fact that the filmmakers wanted to show this relationship, but were trying to find a way to not outright condemn Jefferson, I thought was one of the most intriguing purposes of the filmmaker. And I would even go so far as to speculate, and it's just speculation, and I'm going to get on really thin ground and
Yeah.
stereotyping, because the filmmakers were themselves in what was considered, until relatively recently, a very unorthodox and out of sync with society relationship of their own, namely their own gay relationship. Um, I think they were trying to actually show a quote unquote understanding of Jefferson and Sally's very, very unorthodox relationship, and didn't approve of it, but didn't totally condemn it either. And to me, that was kind of a shocking possible purpose of what they were trying to accomplish.
It's also worth noting not only are they gay, but Ishmael Merchant is Indian,
Yes.
and James Ivory was American, so they have an interracial relationship. And their screenwriter is Ruth Prower. I didn't even know how to pronounce her last name, so sorry about this. Havala.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's also Indian, but was born in Germany. So it's so yeah, maybe I think they're also trying to show an understanding. I'm also guessing that the three of them are all good liberals who actually admire Jefferson but are perplexed by him. This
Right.
movie. this movie came out in 1995 when Bill Clinton was president, and the sexual peccadillos of the presidents were being discussed more openly. And I think they're trying to understand what makes him tick and put everything about slavery and sexuality into context. But if you think about it, if you were to tell someone that a 44-year-old white man was betting and impregnating his 14-year-old slave, you'd think, oh my God, that's terrible. But the movie seems to say, well, it's actually kind of complicated, you know? And
Yeah, I think they were trying to, the way they threw in gratuitously many references to Jefferson being opposed to slavery, thinking it was
yeah,
evil, wanting anti slavery language in the Declaration, but others took it out. You know, they were, I think they were actually perplexed is a good word for it, Gary. I think they wanted to be sympathetic. They couldn't really excuse or justify his relationship with Sally in script lines. So they did it in the way scenes were acted out. And if this, you know, we always talk about movies, could they be made today? If this same movie were being made today, Jefferson would be portrayed as a rapist,
oh
not
yeah,
as a guy that's sort of mourning his ex-wife, lying laconically in his chair, and Sally is doing these fetching little dances and come-ons all around him. I mean, I think that if I was politically correct, that is appalling to portray her that way.
I agree. I was shocked. I mean, I literally was shocked that it makes her the aggressor rather than him. And I think I think everyone who's associated with this movie should be glad that this actually was a bomb, and it's hardly ever discussed because the idea that Sally was complicit in the relationship has not aged well at all.
No, not at all. And you know, where do you think that comes from, Gary? Because I haven't read the Fawn Brody book. I don't know if you have.
No, I haven't either.
I know that it took quite a lot to actually prove that, you know, that he really did have a relationship and fathered children with her. And even the very stodgy Jefferson Foundation Society now says that they believe it's true. But how does anybody know what the behind closed door
Right.
dynamic was? So they had to be speculating. I don't think there was any documentary evidence to establish the idea that Sally was the one that was very flirtatious and very touchy and doing provocative dances and making him laugh and being very endearing. Where could they have gotten that documentary
I don't know.
evidence?
I don't know. As I said, I think they were trying to excuse him in some respects. I mean, this is again, you know, there's a lot of excusing going on when Bill Clinton was president, and
Right.
which we now look back on as like, oh my God, I can't believe we used to think that. But
And this is why, Gary, I think we have to say, as a kind of disclaimer, if anybody listening is really outraged by this notion, then they shouldn't see the movie.
yeah, this is a trigger warning. This is the first trigger warning we've issued.
Yes, it really is. Now, if you put that aside, if you're able to compartmentalize that and just watch how it unfolds without the morality behind it, and look at her performance, which was very good, by the way, Newton's performance,
Yeah.
then it's okay. And they're not saying it was okay. I don't think they would dare do that. And there is a penultimate scene we'll talk about where I think it's made pretty clear the moral scales tip back to how dehumanizing slavery could be. But if anybody really finds this offensive, whether, you know, from the gender standpoint or the racial standpoint, they shouldn't see this movie.
Yeah. I would say there's another interesting theme going on here. Maybe it's inadvertent, but you have the French aristocrats. I think that they're making a comparison between the French aristocrats and the Virginia slaveholders, that they have more in common than you think. At one point, when Maria asks one of the French counts why he doesn't escape from France before he gets strung up, he says, "Oh, you don't understand the deep affinity between us and the people." And that's the same kind of language that the Southerners use, like, "Oh, you Northerners, you don't understand the relationship we have with the slaves. We're taking care of these people." And he's as self-deluded as the slave owners who think their household slaves love them. So,
Right.
um,
I think that's a good point. I'd also say, as a kind of flip side, you can really see, as you mentioned, Jefferson's affinity and homesickness for Virginia, which was probably portrayed as one of the reasons why he ultimately was more attracted to Sally than he was attracted to Maria, who was that very sophisticated European, beautiful woman.
yeah.
And when it came down to it, he wanted to be more like a good old boy missing Virginia, and found more to relate with on that score to Sally than he did with Maria.
Well, the other thing that's weird about this is that he is portrayed here as very passive and emotionally repressed when it comes
Yes.
to his relationships with women. I mean, they're all clamoring for him, and he's like, "Oh, my wife, my dead wife." I don't. But anyway, speaking of um, being portrayed, so let's talk about the actors.
Mm-hmm.
What about Nick Nolte, who plays Jefferson?
I would say just okay, and no more than that. Um, Not a total flop. His advantage was is that none of us know how Jefferson really looked and sounded. So, for example, I could be a little more believing of him than I was of Bill Murray playing FDR,
Yeah.
because I know more about how FDR looked and sounded. But he was pretty stiff, and maybe that was intentional, how they wanted to portray him. I could generally believe him, but it worked better when he didn't open his mouth. I thought his romantic scenes with Maria were pretty bad when his lines of dialogue, his love lines, if you will. But I thought it was a gutsy role for him to take on. He was a former pinup model, a People magazine sexiest man alive one year. Quite a jump for some of the things I remember him in, like The Deep, where Jacqueline Bisset and Nick Nolte were in bathing suits for 2.5 hours, and everybody loved that, regardless of their preferences. Just okay. What did you think?
I thought he was okay. I thought he was okay. I would have expected someone a little bit taller, a little bit thinner. The problem is we know Nick Nolte as an actor, and if Jefferson is supposed to be like this genius Renaissance man, it just doesn't really come across. He is emotionally remote for sure, and doesn't really talk much about his feelings, which is probably par for the course for men back then. We hadn't really entered the romantic period yet, where people let their feelings fly. Um, but he's portrayed as a true, traditionally clueless man. I mean, think about it. He's sleeping with a 14-year-old slave. He's trying to get a married woman to leave her husband and run away with him in Monticello. He's weirdly, erotically involved with his daughter, and he can't understand why all the women in his life are upset with him. He's like a husband who's given his wife a vacuum cleaner as a birthday present and is left standing outside the door yelling, "What's the matter? What did I do wrong?" So
Yeah, I think that's a good take. It's hard to, I mean, Nolte is a reasonably respected actor.
yeah,
I mean, it's not like we're not talking in terms of intellectual versus He-Man. We're not talking a Stallone type character or, that kind of thing. He was nominated 3 times for Oscars. So, he's reasonably respected, but he had this bad boy Hollywood image. And I think this was a good part for him to attempt as he was getting old and out of his action sports hero or action hero kind of days. So,
I think he's actually a little old, you know. I mean, he was 10 years
yeah,
older than Jefferson, and he kind of looked it. I mean, I'm sure that Jefferson at 44 was a little more vigorous than Nolte is here. Well,
yeah.
Gwyneth Paltrow.
Well, at first, in her opening scenes, I thought the look on her face looked like, how do I get out of this movie? I mean, she did not look like a happy camper, and I couldn't tell whether, because I didn't know what the character was going to be like yet.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell if that was the character or her. I just didn't like her in this movie that much. I thought she got better as the film went along. She became an important figure in the movie, but I thought her attitude seemed a little too modern for me.
Yeah.
And I thought her accent kind of slipped. I didn't really hear a Virginia accent till toward the end. And I don't know I don't know what order they filmed the
I think
scenes
all
in.
the accents in this movie sort of came and went.
Yeah, so did Maria's accent.
Yeah,
If
sometimes she's Italian and sometimes she's not.
right, but
Um,
I didn't think this was one of Paltrow's better outings, and she's obviously an accomplished actress.
yeah, I mean, this was very early in her career. She wasn't really a movie star yet. If you when you watch the credits roll in the beginning, I mean, she's like sixth down in the
Yeah,
sixth down there. She later that year she came out in the horror movie Seven, and then she was actually in Miramax movies, where she won her Academy Award. She's fine. I mean, she's whatever. She never smiles in the whole movie, I don't think. It's sort of like father like daughter in this movie. He doesn't, smile very much either.
right.
Um, and but a big problem with the character is that the real Patsy Jefferson was only 12
Oh,
when she
really?
arrived in Paris. Yeah,
Yeah.
and 16 when she left. So when Paltrow was 22. And of course, at 20, she plays this. She's the same age. They're there for 4 years. So you have a 12-year-old going to 16. You would presumably have a lot of growth during that period, but you don't see any of that, and you can't. I mean,
Yeah,
because it's but she's not the right age at all. All right.
right.
The second, the actual co-star of the movie was Greta Scacchi, who's not
Yeah.
someone that we've seen a lot in a lot of movies. We don't need to talk a lot about her, but what do you have to say for her?
Well, I actually thought she showed more depth and nuance than either Nolte or Paltrow. Um, First of all, she's just so beautiful to
Yeah,
look at. So her profile and her facial features, couldn't really see any more in that with these costumes, but no, it wasn't like the Deep, Jacqueline Bisset. But I liked her. I did think her Italian accent sort of came and went, but I thought she carried off her role pretty well.
yeah, I thought she was. I mean, I found her very believable, and I see why Jefferson was attracted to her. She's a tiny bit annoying. She's always whining, like you don't write, you don't call, you don't love me anymore. I mean, come on. But I guess that's her way of flirting. The whole
Yeah,
character, that whole thing is weird anyway. I mean, she's married to this gay guy, and he wants her to go to Monticello with him. What does he think is going to happen? I mean, like they didn't just run away from husbands back then,
right.
he never would have been secretary. I mean, he would have been scandalized if
Yeah,
he'd shown up in Virginia.
especially at the hands of your Federalist Party.
Yes, I mean we would have taken we would have taken
I'm
him
not going to
apart.
let that go.
Well, I am a Federalist. I mean, I like the bank and I like
The Sedition
fortunately,
Act and
yeah. All right. So the woman who played Sally,
yeah, we
Amanda
just saw
Y.
her.
Newman. Yeah, okay. Yes, we did. I
She
was
was
shocked when I looked at her IMDb and saw that we'd just seen her.
she was Condi Rice in W.
Yeah.
and Athandaway Newton.
I think she's a
Um,
lot better as Sally than she was as Condi.
yes, I thought she was beautiful and alluring. Um, she made the audience see why Jefferson couldn't resist her, and I feel creepy for saying that.
Yeah.
But as I said, it was just a shocking performance in terms of
Well,
what it represented. I wonder what she thinks about that today.
oh, I'm sure she kind of regrets it. The thing about this, again, um, you and I, as adult men, can see why he'd be attracted to her. But she was 23-year-old actress when she made this. I mean, she's not. If
Right.
they had cast a 14-year-old girl as an age appropriate girl for this part, people would not have had any kind of sympathy for him. They would have thought he was a pervert and a
Right.
rapist. Yeah.
Right.
So you're right. That's a good question. I wonder what she does think, if she ever thinks about this part, because again, no one ever sees this movie, so no one's going to say,
Right.
why did you play this role?"
Yeah.
Are there anyone
Yeah.
else you want to talk about?
Well, I would just say, I mentioned Seth Gillum as James
Yeah.
Hemings. He ended up having an important role at the end, but he was just too modern for my taste. It
Yeah.
reminded me of one of the Black Union soldiers at the beginning of
Oh yeah.
Lincoln,
Right.
Spielberg, where the speech and the points of view, all of which I agree with, by the way, then
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in this movie,
Right. Sure. Sure.
nonetheless sounded like the 20th century or 21st century.
Okay.
Um, and then I've got to point out a James Bond connection.
Okay. Good.
Michael Lonsdale, who played the king, was Hugo Drax, the prime villain in Moonraker.
Okay.
Because a lot of Moonraker was filmed in France as well.
Okay. All
So,
right.
got it. Couldn't leave that on the
You got
cutting
a
room
Beatles
floor.
connection somehow?
I don't have a Beatles connection. No, I'll work on it.
Well, yeah, I think if we wanted to do a 6 degrees of separation thing, we probably could. All right, let's talk about the history and the
Mm-hmm.
overall accuracy. So, as far as I can see, the structure of the story is accurate. I mean, surprisingly accurate. The characters are where they should be when they should be. I thought it was. I actually thought, oh, they've got this all wrong. Because I didn't realize that Jefferson was right there just as the French Revolution got underway. So when the Estates General met and all that kind of stuff, I just said, "Oh, I didn't." I actually thought that Jefferson was back in the United States by then. But so I think
Yeah,
the movie was overall, things were happening when they actually did happen, and people were. And the Maria Causley thing was true. Everything about that was true. They did write a lot of passionate letters to each other, and they were friends, and they actually remained friends afterwards.
right. I agree. I thought it was pretty accurate, shallowly accurate in
Yeah,
many respects. It just
yeah,
wasn't deep in the history. But the one thing is open to question is whether he began his relationship with Sally in Paris or back in Virginia. I think there's still some debate about that. Um, it's also apparently accurate in terms of him keeping his basic promises to
yeah,
the Hemings family
yeah,
about their freedom and freeing Sally's children when they turned 21, freeing her after his death, and freeing James Heming after a couple years of work back at Monticello, giving him his freedom. So I agree. I think it was, I don't think they took a lot of license with the history. And, as much as we might be a little shocked at the way the denouement of the Hemings Jefferson relationship played out, um, they did have the guts to put all that in film, and it
yeah.
hadn't
No,
been
no. I
done
mean,
before. So,
well, exactly. Because when the movie came out, um, there was still a lot of dispute about whether or not,
right,
no, except for Fawn Brody, no one else um, was claiming that Jefferson and Hemings were, were together, because the historians at the time were all saying, "Oh, well, Jefferson was against sexual relations between the races, and so he never would have done it himself." um, and it was only later when they did DNA testing that they found out that, oh, oops, yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
I think it moved the historical ball along.
yeah.
And you can argue about the exact way they did it, but it did move things along. And as I said at the outset, as much as I admire Jefferson, this should be the part of the record and should be part of the teachings.
And I would also say that this is not. You accuse me in a way of being, judging a character by today's standards, but I would judge him by the standards of the 1780s as seen from the North. I mean, he was condemned up in the North for being a slaver. And so it's not something that's, I'm not just coming up with this stuff because
Well, that's true, but also, Gary, every single colony had slaves. And I'm not sure the exact year that, say, a place like Pennsylvania or a place like Massachusetts made it illegal, but it wasn't too many years before this time period we're talking about that New York had more slaves than Virginia.
yeah.
So it wasn't that, I won't say black and white, but it wasn't that, A or B. It wasn't
Yeah,
that A
no,
or
I
B
know,
as
I
you.
know. But they were, I mean, the northern states voluntarily got rid of their slaves.
Yeah, and they got on the right side morally a hell of a lot quicker, to say the least, than the South did. And I assume you're not advocating Jefferson to be canceled and the
No,
Jefferson Memorial to be torn down and all that
no,
kind
no,
of
no,
stuff.
none of that. No, I'm
Some
not
people
saying,
are. Yeah.
but I will say that it does irk me that, yeah, it seems to me that George Washington gets more criticism than Jefferson does. And I think it's because Jefferson was a liberal and Jefferson was on the common man and yada yada, and Washington was a Federalist, and but Washington freed his slaves when he died,
Hmm.
and Jefferson
He
didn't.
couldn't.
He
Well,
couldn't
he
because
was
he was
broke.
bankrupt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Favorite scenes.
Favorite scenes. What is your favorite scene if you have
Well,
one?
I think my favorite scene was the last scene between James and Sally when they confront Jefferson, and Gwyneth Paltrow makes a brief but important appearance. And it's the kind of scene that's thoroughly ridiculous and riveting all at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, they basically confronted Jefferson, and at first they both wanted to stay. Then Sally realizes that she would actually be happier back in Virginia. She thinks Virginia is more like her home than Paris. And they make Jefferson swear on the Bible that he would keep his word, that they could have, that James could have his freedom. And they made Patsy come in because in case anything happened to Jefferson, Patsy might be calling the shots. And they made her swear, and she sort of unhappily grunts, I swear. And then and I just thought that scene had me glued to the screen to find out what was going to happen. That was my favorite scene. I would
All
have to
right.
point out there was a lot of N word in that scene.
Oh yeah.
And so that's another trigger warning as
Yeah.
well.
I'm not
Did you
saying.
like that scene?
Yeah, I like that. I did like that scene. I thought the last 15 minutes of the movie were the strongest parts of the movie. So most of my favorite lines and one of my favorite scenes are from there. I did, and it's hard. You go back and it's like, what did I really like? I mean, Um, I did think the scene where they have Dr. Guillotine at his dinner and he's chopping the asparagus in half using a little mini. I'm sure this is kind of ridiculous, so maybe I don't know if it is, but he's got this little guillotine and he's chopping the asparagus at half, and everyone thinks it's a huge joke, without knowing that like they're
Some
next.
of them would get to try out the real guillotine. That was a good one.
I would say I thought a even more powerful scene was when Patsy breaks down in front, Maria comes and is like, "What's the matter with you?" and Patsy's like, "I can't tell you, it's unspeakable." And and Maria says, "But isn't he a good master?" And she says, "Yeah, uh, he's the best master, but he still owns slaves, and they hate us having them, and that she hates having them around because she knows they hate her, and that they're always there just judging them." And
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, this is very, it's a terrible thing for her. Although I, I, I'm not sure there's any truth to this scene because, the actual Patsy, Martha, the daughter Martha, grows up to be a slave owner herself, and she certainly never frees any of her slaves. And so I don't know, maybe she got over it once she got married and liked having slaves around.
Yeah, I like that. I did also like the one that you thought could have been left out of when Jefferson confronts that Mother Superior in
Yeah.
the convent. He's very upset that Patsy's decided to become a Catholic nun. And I like the way that she answered him, which was in so many words, "Oh, so you like religious freedom until someone makes a free choice that
Yeah.
you don't like." And that's echoes of today, isn't it?
Right.
We
Right.
all like free speech and we all like freedom of choice until it's speech we don't like
Right.
or choices we don't like.
Right.
I thought
Right.
that was a good one. And then there was a little snippet of a scene when he was presenting his credentials to the king as the minister, and
Yeah.
the every time the words His Majesty were mentioned, they all had to take their
Oh
hats
yeah.
off. So the hats kept going on and off. I just thought that was a moment of levity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's pretty funny. So when we talk about favorite lines, I have to say I appreciate a writer like Elaine May, who wrote Primary Colors. When you're looking for favorite lines in a movie like this, in
It's
Primary
hard.
Colors, there were line after line after line that I wanted to say, this is my favorite line. I really just search here to find one. But I did think I only laughed. This isn't hardly a comedy. I only laughed once when Sally was kind of seducing Jefferson. Jefferson's in bed and she's pretending to be scared of ghosts and talking about Molly, another slave girl whose body was dragged up from the pond and mostly decomposed when she came up. And her vivid description of how she was all decomposed was hilarious. And, like, for example, there wasn't a morsel of brain left in her skull. You know, it's just so vividly gross, and
Right.
she delivers it so innocently. It's just it was funny.
I like the one of the lines that Maria um, said to Jefferson when she was complaining about not getting letters from him. She said, "I wrote you constantly. You wrote me back about smoked bacon and hogs." I just thought
Well,
that was a good touche
well, that's
line.
Thomas Jefferson being at his emotionally, remote and cluelessness.
Well, also the disconnect between high European society and back in Virginia. Um, and then I also liked when one of Gwyneth Paltrow's lines when um, Maria was playing the harpsichord and all that, and she sort of cattily said, "Yes, Mrs. Cosway plays well," because she was upset that Maria was making a play for her
Right, right,
father.
right,
I
right,
thought
right,
that was
right.
good. But my favorite, you're right, it's hard to find favorite lines in this script. Some of my favorite lines were the postscript slates at the very end, because there was a touch of irony in several of them. When they said what happened to each of the
Yeah, yeah,
characters,
yeah.
um, that Patsy was going to become the celibate nun, ended up marrying and having like a dozen children.
Oh yeah, exactly,
So I
exactly.
thought that was fun. What talk about a reversal of decision. And then I thought it was also sadly ironic that the postscript on James
Yeah,
Hemings, he got his freedom, yes, but then he drank himself into oblivion and committed suicide at a young
yeah,
age.
yeah,
And again, freedom doesn't necessarily solve everything, is what I took
yeah,
from
yeah.
that.
Well, at one point, Sally says to him, "You talk about being a slave, but you're a slave to your bottle."
Yeah,
Um, and I have to say, this was slightly tricky that Jefferson, he demands to be paid 20, to his 24 francs, and what does he spend it on?
right. Yeah,
Alcohol.
again, I'm not, there's no suggestion they were trying to justify the good points
Yeah,
of slavery,
yeah. No,
but
I
it
know, but
is,
it's just like,
it's
ooh boy,
ironic. It's just an
it's
irony.
ironic, and he did,
It's
and it
thought
was,
provoking.
yeah, and he actually was an alcoholic, so okay. I mean,
Right.
but it was like you give a slave money and he just blows it on booze. Um, and there was one. I thought another powerful scene and line was when Sally says, like she likes the master, um, and uh, and James Hemming says to her, "You know what our white father did for us? He gave us away for a wedding present when his white daughter, our white sister, married Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson will do the same when his daughter gets married. You'll get thrown in with the pots and pans that she takes away from Monticello." And you're right. I mean, these guys have a father, and they realize that their father doesn't care about them, and thinks they're like pots and pans. I mean, it was, pretty
Yeah,
tough.
I think James, in many ways, was definitely the conscience of the movie.
Yeah,
So I'll
yeah,
give him that, even though his articulateness and phrasing were very modern
yeah.
and not of the 18th century.
All right. So, what's the relevance or of this movie today, or a comparison to politics today? I mean,
Well, it's
is it
hugely
relevant at
relevant.
all? Yeah,
It's hugely relevant and in many respects aggravatingly irrelevant because it opens the whole debate about how we should judge once revered founding fathers against today's standards. Do we make allowances for the mores of the time, with slavery being a very ubiquitous institution? Do we make any allowances, not justifications, not approvals, but allowances, or do we not? I think that's unresolved question for today, and even the elapsed time from when this movie came out, 2005 to 2023, we've seen that needle move quite a bit, even in those 2 decades.
yeah. I mean, it's on the wrong side of both the Me Too movement and the George Floyd, post George Floyd time. So, but it does raise those issues, and yes, it is relevant to that respect. I'm sure that if the filmmakers had a chance to do it over, they would probably either wouldn't do it at all, or they would do it differently.
which is what which is what I was going to say to our question we like to explore at the end, which is, could it be made today?
Yeah,
And I think yes, but it would have to be completely recast in terms of the Jefferson Sally relationship. Any kind of sympathetic portrayal would have to be completely taken out, and he'd have to be portrayed as kind of a rapist and a child molester.
yeah. I don't. I mean, right. I mean, they could maybe address this issue, or but you're right. They would. This particular movie could not be made today like it was. And I'm not even sure they would even bother to try, because um, Jefferson still has some cachet among old-fashioned liberals, but not among the progressive left. And to say nothing, he never really had much cachet among conservatives. So, trying to navigate something that would make the liberals and progressives happy, I don't know if that's even possible. So,
And when they already found out that there's a small audience to begin with,
there's a
so
small audience for this
so
kind of
the
movie.
slivers of an audience then would become even more microscopic now.
Um, if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Hell no, I don't want to get fired. Absolutely not. It would be a fireable offense even if you had tenure.
Yeah. I agree. All right. What's your grade for the movie?
I'd say a C plus. It's an interesting concept. I'm glad they did it. I thought it was an interesting period of his life and a historical chapter to explore. Um, but the execution falls short for me. Some of the acting falls short. Um, it's not really a presidential movie, but I don't think it's a failure either. I'd say it's worth a watch, but not compelling priority.
Yeah, I would give it a B minus. I might have liked it slightly more than you, or maybe you're just a harder grader. I don't know. I wasn't bored. Um, I was surprised at the way they um, did some of the, cast some of these issues. But I thought it was fine. I mean, and I'm with you. I mean, I wouldn't rush out and watch it. It wouldn't be high on my list of that. All right. Well, we've done Thomas Jefferson. I think this is probably the only Thomas Jefferson movie out there, unless we do 1776, which
I'm
I
not
don't
looking
think we're going
forward
to
to
get to
that.
that. Have you ever seen that?
No.
1776? It's a
Uh,
musical about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So I
oh
saw it.
boy.
It's not that bad. Uh, Thomas Jefferson quotes John Locke. So
In song?
no, in a it's when he's writing it, I think he quotes it to John Adams or something. So he's not doing Jacques Rousseau. He's doing John Locke instead. All right. So I want to emphasize again, this podcast is now available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most of your podcast platforms. Please subscribe there. And our next movie is going to be Nixon Frost. So
or Frost Nixon. I can't
Frost
remember
Nixon,
which.
sorry, Frost Nixon,
Right.
sorry, Frost Nixon, which is available on Prime. You can watch it there. And if you have any comment, send me an email at garyholmes76@gmail. And I'm gonna close this out with, I'm gonna play for us the "What Did I Miss" song from Hamilton. So stick around for 2 minutes of Thomas Jefferson singing "What Did I Miss."
Simply must be Thomas, Thomas.
Thomas Jefferson's coming home.
Thomas Jefferson's coming home.
Thomas Jefferson's coming home.
Thomas Jefferson's coming home.
Thomas Jefferson's coming home, but he's been off in Paris for so long.
France is following us to revolution. There is no more status quo. But the sun comes up and the world still spins. I helped Lafayette draft a declaration. Then I said I gotta go. I gotta be in Monticello. Now the work at home begins. So what did I miss? What did I miss? Virginia, my home, sweet home, I wanna give you a kiss. I've been in Paris meeting lots of different ladies. I guess I basically missed the late 80s. I traveled the wide, wide world and came back to this. There's a letter on my desk from the president. Haven't even put my bag down yet. Sally BLM, darling, won't you open it? It says the president's assembled in a cabinet, and then I end up being the Secretary of State. Great, that I'm already sent and approved. I just got home and now I'm headed up to New York.
New York, New York.
Looking at the rolling fields, I can't believe that we are free. Ready to face whatever's awaiting me in NYC. But who's waiting for me when I step in the place? My friend James Madison, red in the face. He grabs my arm and I respond, let's go. Thomas, we are engaged in a battle for our nation's very soul. Can you get us out of the mess we're in? Hamilton's new financial plan is nothing less than government control. I've been fighting for the South alone. Where have you been? France? We have to win. What did I miss?